Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jeffrey Smith. This is his second appearance on my channel, The One in the Many. Dr. Smith, thank you very much for agreeing to come back and have a discussion with me.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated our last conversation, and this is going out into territory that's I've thought about, but I haven't really discussed with anybody, and so I'm looking very forward to hearing your point of view and having some back and forth, and hopefully learning some more in the process.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I purposefully said good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because today we are separated by this small pond called the Atlantic Ocean. You're in France, I'm in New York, and so you split your time between New York and France, and it's great to be able to connect with you. So I reached out to you and asked you if you would join me because I'm really interested in this attempt of mine, at least, to find a unit perspective in psychology, or at least to not so much to find, but to identify if there is any potential for a unit perspective, in the sense that any science has some kind of measure, some kind of measuring standard. In biology, we have the identification of the cell and inheritance as the fundamental unit and process of studying biology in any living form. So in chemistry, we have the identification of the atom and everything that involves that atom. And so every science has some kind of standard and its unit. And in psychology, we don't have that readily available to us. And yet we have a very sophisticated, rich history of trying to explain all psychological experience. And what has our concentration been, in my view, is mostly focusing on mediating or trying to resolve something that we identify as abnormal behavior, abnormal sensation, abnormal feeling, emotions. And so psychotherapy is where the focus of psychology has merged into, and it has become central to the discipline. But it hasn't shown any uniform scientific pursuit of it. And one of your efforts as a clinician, as a professional in the field, and then later on in your career as a leader, taking leadership in the organizations of that field, at least in America, your effort has been to integrate the psychotherapeutical frameworks into one coherent stand. And so you have a unique position to come to this from your clinical experience and absorbing that experience through your thinking about it in a more fundamental, broader framework. So since I have you now, I like you to share with us, whoever us is listening to this and whoever is interested, in not only your forthcoming book, which I know it's going to be coming sometime in September, how psychotherapy
August 20th.
August 20th, great. We have a
2
date.
weeks away.
Yes, congratulations. So I'm really interested in how you're approaching this, how much does it matter from your perspective, the identification of what is normal, what is abnormal? Is there necessity in psychology to identify a standard and a unit perspective to the field?
Wonderful, wonderful question, wonderful introduction. So I don't like normal and abnormal very much, but I think that if we think about it in terms of evolution, we'll get closer to what we really need, and that point of view, the evolutionary point of view, says that the human species has evolved guided by the principle of survival of the species, and so that evolution in the direction of survival has produced I think what I think of as a system, and that system has a tendency to get, as you put it, disintegrated, unintegrated, where we have internal forces pulling in different directions, and that causes a lot of suffering and dysfunction. But we also have a tendency to somehow pull those different parts of our being together so that they can work together in the same direction. I think of vectors of arrows that have power, and when they're all pointing in the same direction, then we feel a tremendous amount of unity and power, and that's the integration that I think you so eloquently talk about. So a metaphor that is, I think, a useful one is that being human is sort of like riding a horse. When I was a kid, I preferred my bicycle because I controlled the bicycle. It did what I wanted. But we also had horses in the family, and sometimes I would ride a horse. And what you learn pretty quickly is you have to listen to the horse and be sensitive to its needs. And for example, when the horse wants to go home, to turn around and go home, then what you do is you let it go ahead and turn, but you keep it turning 360 degrees, and pretty soon it's going off in the direction that you want. So I think that humans, I'm speculating here, but I want to tell a story about how I think human evolution took place. And that is that mammals are oriented towards survival, and for them, survival, for the most part, is a matter of deciding whether a predator is too big and you better run, or a little smaller and you could fight, or maybe it's already too late and you might as well give up and freeze. And those are fairly simple decisions to make, and the brain evolved to be able to make those decisions under varying conditions, and that worked pretty well. Well, then we get to being human, and for us, survival is not a matter of sizing up the predator, because we're too weak, we're too little and too weak to stand up to predators unless we join together. And it's our social cohesiveness that allows us to have a level of power that we're seeing some of the results of it. The problem is that managing social cohesiveness is really challenging to the brain that evolved, the subcortical brain that evolved for survival. And that, for a simple example, telling the difference between who's our friend and who's our enemy is very hard. Is your brother automatically your friend? Well, what if your brother files a lawsuit against you to contest the inheritance? Well, then that person is very, very confusing and difficult. And so it's, in my mind, there are a number of challenges that take place in which the survival-oriented, non-conscious, automatic subcortical mind comes up with answers that are less than optimal. One of the most common and frequent ones that we run into in psychotherapy is that children are sort of aware of what they need in order to grow and develop as they should. And so what happens when one of those needs is not being met? Maybe they're not getting the attention or the support that they really need. Children are not programmed to accept that that's just the way it is and you better get along. What they do instead is the inner mind, in a sense, says, okay, well, I'm just going to put my growth and development on hold and wait till somebody comes along who is going to give me that support that I need. And that happens over and over again. And so then the child says, okay, so I'm going to put my real emotional needs on hold, but in the meantime, I'll just function and I'll learn to handle life as best I can. And so we get a certain kind of development, but there are pieces that are left behind. And that's what shows up often in psychotherapy, where the therapist comes and says, hey, I'm here to help you, and I'm supportive, and I'm empathic, and I understand. And the inner mind says, oh, wow, this is the person I've been waiting for. And that's who's going to solve my problems. Well, then we have a bit of a difficulty, because that nice person still really can't provide what was needed long, long ago, that kind of primary 24/7 attentiveness and understanding without you even having to say what's wrong. And so in a way, we're both offering something positive, but also a disappointment. And working through that and leading to the adult skill of acceptance is often what psychotherapy needs to do. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to transition from waiting and hoping to accepting that life is what it is, and you actually did okay, and so it's time to pick up the pieces and keep moving. So that's an example. But in any case, I do think that that integration it's complex because the way the mind works. Well, let me step back a little bit. Freud came up with an idea of drives, and he said there was a drive that was a loving drive and a destructive drive. Well, that's beautiful for philosophers, but biology doesn't work that way. Biology programs us with many different things that feel good and are good for survival. But you can't just lump them or simplify them. They happen at many different levels and in many different ways. And so I think that we need to be cognizant of that complexity, but be aware that in terms of like simple principles, the one that our mind is set up to go forward towards things that feel good. And those things that feel good are generally things that some part of the brain has evolved to think are good for survival, and to run away from things that feel bad, again, because in some way the brain has been programmed to sees those things as not good for survival. So that's a simple principle, but the application of it is very individual and very complex.
So it is very interesting to me the way, as you put it, evolution evolves. There is no static dimension to the process. It's all dynamic. What it becomes in variance, it only takes a temporal duration. So it's for temporal duration that we experience that constancy, that invariance. In time, things change.
Yeah.
So in a way, Heraclitus, as a pre-Socratic, was correct in his identification that everything changes, nothing abides. But the qualification that Parmenides offers to that is that a thing is what it is. Now, both of them are right, and yet they appear contradictory to each other. What is neglected is the time factor. So, in my framework, I identify consciousness, energy, balance, and time as the fundamental constituents of our experience through existence. So it could be in a moment, it could be in a decade, it could be the whole lifetime. But that duration pretty much establishes the context in which you'll be operating. And so what is interesting to me from evolutionary perspective, since we are first biological beings, we are an animal, as Aristotle pointed out, but we are rational animal. And that rationality doesn't emerge until we now know at least age 2, right? After the first critical period has taken place and many of the neurons have beginning to form networks so we can be operational. But one thing that it's in the autonomic system that we have no control over since birth. It is part of the evolutionary process that a parent gives to a child in their inheritance. And that is, when I'm hungry, I'm going to start crying to indicate to the world that I'm hungry. And somebody's got to hear me. And if my parents or caregivers don't hear me, I'll be suffering. I'll be in trouble, right? I have to rely on nature to help me out. Well, nature is not going to do anything for me unless there's somebody else. And so here is the element that I see as that social cohesiveness emerges or social disintegration emerges. So if my interpersonal element of the autonomic to central nervous system is not coordinated properly from the get-go, there is a potential that I will be misjudging the relationship. The relationship is always there, but it shows up in a different manner.
Yes.
Based on this interaction. And so, to me, the family is central to the whole civilizational aspect of human experience.
Yeah.
And from the family being the fundamental institution, emerges the individual as a sovereign being after that individual has been afforded the time and energy and balance and conscious regulation to develop the selfhood required for existence. So the job of the parent is to make this very dependent, fragile being into independent, strong agent of his consciousness or her consciousness. So I'm fascinated by this process because, as you know, as a psychotherapist, many have developed problems in this interaction, in the ability to show connection with another, inability of showing connection with a process that generates value for them, implicit or explicit. And many have deficiency in the identification of what truly is valuable to them. So life constantly teaches us to adjust our understanding, to adjust our comprehension. But before going into more abstract applications of this, I wanted to point out that what is driving this relationship between the autonomic and the central nervous system, which is to me, the fundamental, because the central system needs developing, and the autonomic system is already there, right? It's given by evolution. It has already evolved. Although, I mean, as far as I know, our understanding of the autonomic nervous system is still not as good. I mean, we have an idea of it, but there's still many upstream, downstream relationships that, you know, it's tissue. How do we really interpret and identify all these tissue exchanges? It's tricky. It's really challenging for us. But at least we are advancing in some form or another to rationalize the interpretations. So what I wanted to point out as a fundamental behind it is something that I learned from Ran Pisaturu, who I interviewed in my channel based on his book, Evaluation of Knowledge. And what he focuses on is causality, is that there is a causal relationship between everything, as you pointed out. It's very different riding a bicycle and riding a horse, because every entity in the world has some kind of causal relationship with the rest of the world. And if we are capable of understanding those relationships, to whatever extent or degree of understanding we can penetrate, that understanding permeates throughout our whole context of existence. And I think that's what makes the process of integration valuable, but it's too broad, too general, and it's not enough to express the functionality of what a unit perspective may offer. Like, it doesn't have the metric function of a measurement stick to measure whatever length, right? And so this is, I think, the most fascinating aspect of this process that I'm intrigued by. And I think your focus on evolution as a guide is a good perspective to hold, especially when you are viewing someone in this moment versus the larger moment of evolution. So, what do you think about that?
Wow, I have a bunch of different things that are coming to mind. The first one is about the philosophers and about what's static and what's changing. And one of the examples that I see over and over again is working with couples, where one member of the couple thinks that you know, he or she loves me, or he or she doesn't love me, and as if that was a static thing. And there's no realization that the attitudes of the other person are in reaction to the things that the individual is doing. And it's a dynamic back and forth relationship where each one's actions affect the other one's reactions. And so I find myself often talking to people about how, well, wait a minute, let's take a look at how you're approaching your spouse and see how that affects your spouse. And I tell people, I will bet you to your great surprise that if you change your behavior, you're going to see a different spouse. And you'll be surprised that they're not the person you thought they were. It works over and over again. So that was one kind of simple example. Another thought is that I think there are principles, there are models that we can bring in that are relatively simple. I talk a lot about accurate empathy, and that is really recognizing that each individual has its own complex system that was set up, and sort of like the butterfly wings in South America that affect weather in North America, some particular experience might have a profound effect, and we can only guess about that in retrospect and hypothesize, but it certainly is worth doing. I have I have one person I'm working with whose dad was very, very severe and moralistic, and frightened his 4-year-old son about the dangers of going to hell and that sort of thing, and I and the other day, this person who's really working hard to try to integrate, to try to behave in ways that are positive, having led a life that was sort of a compromise between doing nothing because it was dangerous, you could get into morally difficult territory, versus trying to live a normal life, really hard to do. So I made an equation for him. I said, the amount of healthy things you do times the degree of healthiness that they represent, like if something is really goes against the sorts of things that his dad warned him about. For example, his dad said that pride is a terrible sin and that success brings you pride, and so you'd better not have success. Whoa. And so the level of success times the amount of activity in that direction equals the amount of anxiety he's going to experience. And this started to make sense when he had a recent rebound of intense anxiety after a good day when he did a lot of healthy things. Now, then I told him recently that there's a fudge factor. There's a line, and under that line, it's the product of those two things divided by his level of progress. Because the more progress he makes, the less anxiety he's going to have with the same amount of healthy behavior. So, it's a simple linear equation that actually is pretty good at predicting the level of anxiety that he's going to experience. Because I want him to be able to say, oh, that anxiety is coming from my inner mind that was programmed when I was 4 years old by my dad, and it's not really valid in terms of what I believe in and what's moral and what's good. Those things are things that I need to leave aside and start behaving in a more consistently healthy way, and let go of those fears that were inculcated so many years ago. So who would have guessed in a man who shows up and has not really been able to develop a career, who would have guessed why that was? So I think the amount of information, we have to do a lot of guessing and a lot of speculation, but in terms of measurement, we can test those things out. That once we develop like this equation, now we can test it out. We can say, okay, what if tomorrow you really go for some healthy stuff, and are you going to feel anxiety or not? Well, if you have some anxiety but not too much, that means you're probably growing. So it's a very useful tool to be able to think about what's going on in terms of those inner motivations that have been working against each other in the past.
I thank you for that example. I think this is very illustrative. It illustrates what I've been working on in terms of anxiety being distanced from the degree of integration you have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what that entails actually is mm-hmm. that if you let me put it in a previous context. So Aristotle was big about matter and form, mm-hmm. right? So matter, we understand in this example, is this person's experience, right? That mm-hmm. experience with his parent. Who is the guide? Who is the central nervous system? The kid mm-hmm. is still the autonomic nervous system. The kid will absorb whatever the central nervous system gives him. If it tells him you are good, he'll be good. If it tells him mm-hmm. you're bad, he'll be bad. Mm-hmm. And that's why we see people develop in the way they develop. The environment shapes them. But we also have free will, right? We can choose to see whether this is good or bad for us, but that
Mm-hmm.
comes much later. You first have to experience whatever you were taught to absorb. And so in that matter form relationship, what is interesting to me is that once you ideate, once you make the form permanent in your understanding, once it becomes your dictator, because you are now a subject of the form.
Mm-hmm.
Father told me that that's my form. That's what I have to follow. That's life for me. That's the form. And so no longer you are connected to matter.
Mm-hmm.
Matter is automatized. It's not to be questioned. It becomes
Mm-hmm.
absolute dictator. And
Mm-hmm.
so now I've adopted the form, and now everything I do is a reflection of the form. It's very difficult to go back, to reduce back to the matter, because the
Mm-hmm.
matter doesn't matter anymore. The form
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah.
And so that is the creation of that context, that now if I subjectify the form to my understanding because of my experience, I am a vessel of the form.
Mm-hmm.
If I objectify whatever the task ahead that I need to accomplish, I focus on the task, on the processes, on the causal factors that involve the accomplishment of the task that needs my interaction with it,
Mm-hmm.
then I am completely abstracting myself from my past and focusing on the task at hand. I'm focusing on the causal factors that require the accomplishment of whatever the task is ahead of me. So now I extract myself from the process. All I'm focusing is on the process itself. I am the tool. And so in the process of that, I develop a new form because I just accomplished something. I succeeded. I achieved something.
Mm-hmm.
And I did it without putting myself in the form that I inherited from my past, just by focusing on the objectification of the thing and neglecting the subject. So now I achieved that. But then, as you pointed out, if there is a conflict between the achievement and the past, then I feel awkward. I feel,
Mm-hmm.
oh my gosh. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed this. This was so
Mm-hmm.
much fun to be immersed in this process.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, I committed a sin. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm a sinner. I have to, repent or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is confusing after a while, or even in the first glance.
Yeah. Yeah.
So being in the moment, so anxiety becomes a distance to the from integration. So if I integrate myself in the process and recognize that I am the agent of that process of integration within the task, then everything else pales in comparison. Everything that I've learned before, it goes up to the significance of that agency, that
Mm-hmm.
I am causing this to happen. Before my interaction with this didn't exist. Now my understanding, effort, and perspective and work made that possible. I did this. And so I should be celebrated for that. And the first celebratory person should be me. I did
Yeah.
this. I'm
Yeah.
proud of it. And this is good. So the closer I am to that integrative process between my agency and my capacity, um, the healthier I feel, because reality immediately tells me you did something good, and reality also tells me you did something bad. So immediately I have this reward or punishment
Yeah. Yeah.
consequence of my
Yeah.
causal relationship. And I think that original form prevents people from seeing the consequences. They just want the form to remain. What do you think?
Well, so you're talking about the core of what I do for a living, and there's a real spectrum between how much those forms are, how resistant they are to change. It's the values and the moral ones are the most resistant to change, and that really explains the difference between coaching and psychotherapy. Coaching assumes that when a person comes up with a better idea of how to live and why this is a better way to approach life, and they're able to put that into practice without further help, then that's positive psychology, and it's what coaching is designed to help with, to support. But there are other people where, like the one that I mentioned, where that's much more difficult, and it really requires a solid concentration. And the more I understand, I think that the information processing that goes on behind the scenes that results in that anxiety is really, it's different from formal logic. It's pattern matching. It operates through, the way synapses are programmed. And what we found is that there's one known mechanism for enduring change to the way those forms are set up in the first place. And they can be changed, but it isn't easy, and it requires a combination of activation of the old pattern has to be in play, and new information has to be delivered to those subcortical structures like the amygdala and places like that. And there's this rather remarkable process of updating the programming, of changing those synapses so that they don't make the same pattern matches anymore. So we're starting to know a little bit more about how that works and how to help people achieve those kinds of changes. But that's in situations where the mind is really resistant to change. And if you ask me, the general reason for resistance to change is that the inner mind takes that as a dangerous thing, that I have this old way of coping with things that's worked for me for a lifetime, and it's essential for my survival. Why would I want to change it and try something untried and new? What makes the difference is a combination of some intellectual clarity that there's a better way, and having somebody that you trust who's there to kind of hold your hand while you make the change, and who represents for us a relationship that makes it feel safe. And that's a lot of what goes on in psychotherapy. So I see it as a wide spectrum. I know there's a lot of talk these days about Marcus Aurelius and the what's the name I'm looking for? The
Stoic philosophy, you mean?
Yeah, the Stoic philosophy, which is based on the idea that if you think that a pattern that you have is not rational or reasonable, that you ought to be able to just change that. Well, some people can and some people can't. It really depends. And so that's where psychotherapy tends to come in, is where it's really hard.
Yeah, I think to go back to what I alluded to in terms of this distinction between the value of integration as a process, which is indispensable in my mind and in my understanding from any activity that we do. I mean, nature itself constantly does that, but we do it with the agency of our consciousness.
Yeah.
where nature does it by whatever um,
Yeah.
means, right? I mean, we as a conscious beings of rational capacity have identified forces, energy,
Hmm.
masses. We develop physical sciences, biological sciences, chemical sciences. So we see the microscopic and the macroscopic events. We see the nanometer and we see light years, but these are way beyond our perceptual capacity. These are conceptual interpretations of measuring standards that have emerged through the perceptual understanding of our experiences. And so, not every one of us is Einstein. Not
Hmm.
every one of us can sense the way I forget her name, but anyway, if someone is deficient of one sensory modality, they'll develop a greater sensitivity in a different sensory modality, right? So every one of us has a different perspective, but what emerges from this difference is also a unified formal understanding of this process. In other words, the process of integration is responsible for function, for some kind of functionality. So we observe for millennia the sky, but only through conceptual understanding of the sky we developed astronomy and uh, the physical interpretation of that observation. We've experienced love and hate since the beginning of the species, and yet only recently we have begun to give it an academic disciplinary um, understanding or interpretation. Um, so, of course, not everyone will be able to demonstrate the same capacity that some idealized form requires or asks for, right? We are dynamic in our own development, but we may be static from the perspective of somebody else's development. Um, you know, Michael Jordan is a very dynamic guy, but to me, he's ideal in an activity that I have never experienced or I'm not interested in. So to me, he's a static being. He's a symbol of greatness. So what? It doesn't affect me. It's a good thing to watch for someone who is interested in the activity, but for someone who is disinterested in the activity, it's meaningless. So if I am not developing capacity of function, then I have no connection to the process. But if I want to develop a capacity of function in some aspect of my existence, and I have difficulties concentrating or um, developing the skill required to manifest that capacity development, then I need help. I need someone helping me unfold the process of development. And I think that's where the value of integration comes in, is that you can take any person, and this is the value of psychotherapy, right? You can take any person with any issue that they may think as an issue, and you can show them the different dynamics that you can unfold this within their process of development, right? But so that kind of speaks to the process of psychotherapy, that it's first chronologically investigatory. You have to investigate what exactly happened to that conscious agent that is seeking help, and then that I'll bring out the work of Rampistur, because he, in the beginning of his book Validation Knowledge, he talks about the difference between chronological and logical order, and I think this is a magnificent tool to implement in any discipline activity, is to recognize that there is a temporal chronological element to anything. But as a conscious person, you have the agency to structure that in a way that you want to effecate in the future. You can make logical order, explicate everything that you want, and focus only on that, and everything else is trivial. Everything else is not as important. And I think if psychotherapy focuses on that, in making the distinction between the chronological and the logical, in a sense of finding the right balance for yourself, as you are the person who is experiencing whatever the problem is, and now you can see a way of getting out of the problematic framework and putting it in a more functional and capacity-oriented ability, then things will start getting much, much better for you and for everybody around you. So that was my long-winded thinking. I got excited a little bit, but but that's that's the direction that I see happening towards identifying what is the fundamental here among all these people experiencing all kinds of problems. What is unifying them? What is the invariant in this relationship? And I more and more come to the understanding is that the process is the same. The process is pretty much, in my terminology that I adapted from Dr. Leonard Pico's work on the DIM hypothesis, which is disintegration, integration, misintegration. He doesn't see it as applicable to psychology, but I disagree on that, and I see it very applicable to psychology, that all these processes, the process is integration, always. That to me is the norm. But what becomes and could be called abnormal is the process of misintegration, like the patient you were working with, or client that you were working with, that said, my father told me when I was 4 years old, this is wrong. And so he became misintegrated in that form. And a disintegrated person will be someone like a gang member that constantly annihilates everything in his path, just because he wants to maintain the coherence of his belonging to that group of people that are constantly annihilating everything around them. And to them, that's the norm from their perspective, right? Being disintegrative is the normal thing, but life doesn't operate that way. Life only operates through integration. And so that's how I see it in that respect.
Yes, I have a chapter in my book called The Plan, and really it's about homing in on trying to understand how we got to where we are, and what exactly needs to change, and then coming up with a plan for doing that. Like in the case that I mentioned, the plan really is undertaking healthier behavior that this person's conscience, working like a conscience is supposed to, says, no, don't do that. That's a bad thing, and inhibits him. In fact, it even inhibits him from feeling pleasure about doing healthy things. And so with each person, I think there's there are some things that work that are sort of general, like people ask sometimes about, well, what are some tips for not procrastinating, for example? And yeah, there are some general things that work. But when we're dealing with really tough problems or major ones or ones that are baffling, where a person has an experience like, like going through life without developing a career, why is that? It takes some work to come up with some understanding, but the framework that really is most helpful, I think, to make sense of those things is that framework of the inner mind that's automatically working constantly from a very early age to find ways to cope, ways to adapt to life. And sometimes those adaptations just turn out later on not to be very, very helpful. And those are the things that need to change. So in his case, I call it civil disobedience. It's doing exactly what his conscience says is not a good thing to do, and going ahead and letting it generate some anxiety, but realizing that the anxiety is something that you can cope with, you can get through, and if you do, eventually that inner mind will start to understand that it's really not so terrible. But each person in my world, the plan is rather different and rather unique, just as each person is unique. So yes, I very much do think that there's a pathway, and you can describe that pathway in a general way, but for each individual person, it involves different factors and balances and things they can, and how much they can tolerate, and so on.
Right. I mean, these are not commensurate, but when we establish the unit of measuring length, we can measure any length. And so establishing a process of integration, you can process any activity from the perspective of integration. So capacity changes, interactions change, everything varies. What is invariant is that they all require some process of integration. You cannot have things in isolation without commensuration. You have to commensurate your experience in a certain form. Aristotle was absolutely right. You have matter, you have form, you have efficacy, and you have finality. You have an end. Why do you do this, the things that you do? So the genius of Aristotle that lives for millennia now, that was forgotten for a long time, and that long time we call in the West Dark Ages, is that there is a path from existence to end. And it's not birth and death. It's I am alive, I am breathing. Well, why am I breathing now? What for? What am I going to do with that process of breathing? And you got to eat, you got to protect yourself, you got to protect everything around you. So I've identified in my framework the 4 fundamental lessons of life. And these are appetite, vulnerability, fragility, and uncertainty. We have to eat, we have to desire love, we have to constantly be curious about our environment, because we're constantly exposed to our environment. We're constantly exposed to the metabolic cycle ending and requiring more energy. We have to eat. And we're fragile. I mean, I cannot go and fight lions and bears. No, I'll die, right? I can fight ants, but not lions. So my fragility requires extra effort. I have to accommodate that fragility. And I don't know what's going to happen next. I mean, I can see only as far as my eyesight allows, and I cannot see around the corner. It's a mystery to me. So I have to devise tools to let me know what's ahead. I have to have expectations. So all of this has to be integrated in a manner that works for me. And I mean, these four lessons are um, indispensable. They're constant. It doesn't matter how developed, how sophisticated, how undeveloped or unsophisticated I am, they're present to me because of my
Hmm.
need.
Yeah.
And if I neglect either one of them, or to a degree sufficient enough to um, cause me harm, I'll suffer.
Hmm.
So I have to optimize against this constant pressure from reality, from my existence, from my breathing, even breathing
Hmm.
itself, the way I breathe.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
very important. And you see it in anxious people, you see it in accomplished people, in not stressed people, in stressed people. Everything matters in that sense.
Yeah.
So to me, that's um, fascinating um, to be able to identify all this and to keep it in perspective when
Hmm.
we encounter whatever the issue is, right? I
Yeah.
mean, being vulnerable is not a bad thing. Being hungry is not a bad thing. Being fragile is not a bad thing. Being uncertain is not a bad thing. It should not cause psychological distress. And yet we've turned all this phenomena into an issue. It
Hmm.
is an existential issue if you
Yeah.
neglect it, but in dealing with it, the process of dealing with those, with accommodating all these requirements of life, it's not a psychological issue in my view.
Yeah. I, those are particular challenges, though, I think psychologically, how to cope with uncertainty. The pharaohs had a lot of trouble with that, and built pyramids in order to try to deal with that uncertainty of what was going to happen to them. And those are real major challenges, especially in early life, and that's when we develop some of the coping mechanisms that we have, and where some people, those coping styles are so strong that they have no interest in any kind of growth or change, and other people do. Um, I, I, I just, I'd like to go back to a couple of things that you said. One was about consciousness, and you mentioned time. And my hunch, I'm not an expert on consciousness, but I have a hunch that time is maybe a really critical factor there, because my feeling is that I think other mammals have some consciousness. They have a consciousness that there's a bowl of food right there and I want to eat some. But what they don't have is what's going to happen when there's no more food in the bowl. And that ability to project in time and to go back in time consciously, I think that's a big part of what makes our experience probably different from many of our mammalian cousins. So that was one thought. I'm just interested in your thoughts about that.
So this is very important in my framework because I speak of proximity in
Hmm.
two ways. One is the physical proximity that everybody is
Hmm.
aware and familiar with, but the other aspect is an aspect of the integrative process that develops this proximity to the activity, and that process occurs in time. So when you observe young children, they don't have the capacity to focus on something for a long duration of time, just like a mammal or
Hmm.
an animal with consciousness has a fleeting perception. It's like perceives one thing in one instance. It's a threat or
Hmm.
not threat. It will stay on something that is not threat for a few seconds, and then move to another thing to focus on. So it's a constant fragmentation of the attentive focus, where the more you develop the capacity of integrated activity, Now you lengthen the duration of focus within that framework of integration that you're pursuing as your end. And so the child now can spend more time with the building blocks than I was guiding him
Right,
to concentrate in the
right,
beginning. And
right.
then later on, lo and behold, the child is gone for like an hour or two, all on it on his own, and doing
Yeah,
all kinds of things. And you're not worried about him because he can handle himself for an hour or two.
yeah,
And then he becomes an 18-year-old, and you send him on to his career, and you don't worry about him because you know he's going to have his career. He can handle himself for a very long time. He has projected out 10 years, 20 years. He's going to build a family. And so it's a progressive development of the ability to sustain effort in the finality of my pursuit. I have purpose, and that purpose guides my volitional attention
yeah,
to it, to the end.
yeah,
I
yeah,
know that I have vulnerability. I know I have fragility. I know I have uncertainty about it. But despite all the challenges, I now have something to focus on. I can stay on it for a long time. Whether the plate is full or empty, I'll stay on it
yeah,
because I know that there is a way for me to figure things out in the future.
yeah,
After I finish this plate, there will be another plate that I can come up with. And it's interesting also civilizationally, if you look at the history of mankind, we started as hunter-gatherers. A
yeah,
hunter-gatherer has a very short span of life, but also has a very short span of attention. I mean, I want these berries, I want this field,
yeah,
and as long as I have the field, I'm okay. So
yeah,
I'll eat as much as I can today. Tomorrow, I have no idea what the day is going to be tomorrow.
yeah,
And so, my interpretation of this activity is that I have to be just like an animal, be very cognizant of my environment at the moment. There is no future for me beyond the moment. And so that's very exhausting. We now know that the brain uses the most energy in the body, and it's so demanding that I cannot allow myself to focus on something unless it's extremely important to me and very meaningful.
yeah,
When it is meaningful, it's actually energizing. It generates more energy because I'm making more connections and so forth. I mean, there's many explanations or interpretations I can give to the value of that concentration. But nowadays, I'm not threatened by a big predator. I am actually building value in my concentration, so I'm
yeah,
rewarded by it,
yeah,
and I live longer. I've
yeah,
I've I've gone from 30 years in the hunter-gatherer society to 80 plus years in modern day. And throughout the process, you can see the agrarian expanded the day of survival that was required by the hunter-gatherer to a season of survival required by
yeah,
the farmer. And then you have
uh-huh,
the industrialists who expanded that life cycle. And then we have the capitalist and the modern day technological advancement affording more and more time. And we are now talking about basically making man immortal, right? Everybody's interested in the longevity of human life, right? And so, I mean, to each his own, but um, we all start from a very limited perspective of our boundaries of physiological uh, being,
yeah,
and that conceptual openness to the limitations of the physiological is where we really started messing up because we are
yeah,
often disconnected from the real, from physical. But
yeah,
as long as we maintain contact with the real physical reality and expand our conceptual form, then there is no issue, there is no problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why I'm focused
Yeah.
on my IIR cycle that I call it, induction, integration, reduction cycle. You can have the best inductions, you can have the best
Yeah.
organization of your coherence of the integrated knowledge that this induction offers. If you don't reduce back to the units that gave rise to your inductions, you'll be lost.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you experience in psychotherapy.
Yep. Yep. Well, I like to think these days, I mentioned in the beginning that I'm not too much of a fan of normal and abnormal. I like to think in terms of healing and growth. That healing is undoing the things that are holding us back, that might be holdovers from some time earlier or from even some recent traumatic event. And then there's growth, and that's fascinating, and it's again very, very individual and unique for each person. But I think you're talking some about that too. That wherever we are, there are places we can go that we haven't been before that are going to be rewarding and interesting and good. And I think that taking both of those into account really helps. As a physician, my training was more in what's wrong and what's not normal. But over time, I've become to appreciate more the whole world of well, okay, then what? What are we going to do as we let go of some of the things that have held us back and come up with new directions? That's a place that's fascinating, and where I don't want to be the person who's going to decide what direction an individual should take. It's hard enough to figure that out for myself. I don't want to be in a position to figure it out for other people. I'll let them do that.
I think you're absolutely right. And one thing that I recently have been focusing on is this dynamic of the developmental unit.
Mm-hmm.
And that suppose the dynamic unit is that functionality of developing capacity through the integrative process. Well, why is it dynamic? Why is it not static? One issue that arises from this process is that, let's say I want to go to LA today from New York. Fine. So this is very certain, very definite goal, and I know everything about that goal that can make it happen, and I make it happen. And then the way I make it happen, I buy an airplane ticket, I go to the airport, and then at the airport I get a phone call and say, hey, this happened, you cannot go to LA, you got to stay in New York. Fine. Change my plans. Now what happened? I just annihilated my plan, my goal to get to LA. Why? Because there was something more important, something developed in the moment that overtook my plan, my purpose, my plans. Everything was gone in a second because something happened. Now, if I had to stay in New York, it means that it was more meaningful for me to stay in New York than go to LA. Because if it was more meaningful for me to go to LA, I'll neglect the message and I'll just get going. So in that resolution of the change of plans, I just manifested growth. I show that I find this much more valuable to me, much more important to get rid of my plan and stay where I was, because this was more important to me to take care of. And what I think you're alluding to is that people stop growing when they get stuck on the fact that they made the goal to go to LA, and they'll go to LA no matter what. And there's no growth, because
the word that I use is frozen in time. When people's goals or their needs get frozen in time, that creates problems and creates, arrows that are pointing in different directions, and a lack of integration. And that's it's a very useful concept to think that what we want to do is we want to get alignment. We want to get those things integrated in a new way. But what that new way is going to be is often something that's emergent that you wouldn't be able to guess.
Right. And unless you have that inquisitive attitude towards your definitions, towards your definite goals,
Yeah.
if you don't constantly investigate what is the clearest, what is the most efficient, what is the most beneficial process that will allow me to achieve what I just formulated, you will never achieve the most optimal outcome. You will achieve some outcome, but it may not be the most optimal. And you may die ignorant of it, which is okay. But if your goal is to get the clarity of what you want to achieve, the best what you want to achieve, and that's what your drive is, then you have to maintain it. If you want to be at ease with yourself, I don't want to be limited by some kind of rigidity that doesn't allow me to expand. Now, having said that, there are certain relations that must be held rigid. And so in the same way that I cannot escape appetite, I cannot escape vulnerability or fragility or uncertainty. There is nothing in this world, in my nature, that can obliterate those conditions for me in the world, no matter, as you pointed out, even if I build a pyramid, I'm still not certain whether the pyramid will hold or not. It can collapse on me. So even the safest place that I think I have developed for myself can still generate uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah.
And so what becomes fundamental is what I guess humanity has been exploring for as long as it has come to a conceptual understanding, and that is love. Love is very rigid, and at the same time, it's very flexible. So when you are in love, as you pointed out in terms of couple interactions, when you're in love, you allow for the appetite, for the vulnerability, for the fragility, for the uncertainty. And you are very attentive to all these processes.
Yeah.
But you come from a place of love. You don't come from a place of indifference or hate or unimportance. This is very important to you because you are in love. And the other thing is the identification. I mean, you have to identify. You have to be very rigid about your identification process. In other words, you cannot just let things go unidentified. And I think I remember one of my professors used to quote Confucius that, you know, things have to be called for what they are, and they have names. And so there is a demand that you identify, but we also misidentify. And so if you're not able to make a distinction between your capacity for misidentification and you get rigid about your identifications, then you may suffer the consequences of that.
Yeah.
So
Well, I just want to add one thing to that, which is going back to riding a horse. I think that being aware and conscious and logical and thoughtful about what our goals are is fine, but we also need to be curious about there's a set of values and goals and things that exist outside of consciousness that are very, very important. I think often that the inner mind really owns the biggest part of our motivation, and we need to be in harmony with that, and not just think of imposing ways on our inner mind, but rather working with it, and just like a good horse rider, taking both into account. So I think I do a lot of thinking about problems before I go to sleep, and then harvesting the answers when I wake up, because I know that my inner mind has different ways of processing information and comes up with different answers often than I would have come to consciously. So I think that I would want to describe the process you're talking about of growth as a very flexible, creative, tentative, experimental sort of attitude on what directions we take. Because if we're too rigid about it, then we get a mismatch with our inner mind, and that just creates trouble.
Right. It's, again, my framework's understanding is, it has a philosophical lineage to Aristotle, Ayn Rand, and Ron Pisaturo. So I'm basically trying to extend their philosophical formulations and give it a psychological form of a systematic integration as science.
Yeah.
So what comes out of those frameworks of formulation and thinking is, especially Aristotle's identification of the causes. What that suggests is that you are conscious of the matter, and that relationship you have with the matter formulates, gives a form, right? So you come up with a form based on the matter. So your consciousness identifies things, but you cannot be constantly conscious. You're going to live very short life, like the hunter-gatherer. So you have to have a mechanism, like you call it inner mind. I call it subconscious. So you let the subconscious accumulate your integrations that are meaningful to you, that have to do with the appetite, with the vulnerability, with the fragility and uncertainty. And so you start structuring them and build the networks that the nervous systems allow for. But that nervous system is connected to your whole organism. So then the liver becomes important, the heart becomes important, the gallbladder, every element of your organism becomes.
Well, I think we're talking about the same thing in slightly different terms, but we're really it's very much in tune, and your concept of integration and lack of integration is a very valuable and flexible and useful concept, and I couldn't agree more. I think we're speaking, each of us preaching to the choir here.
Well, my goal with our conversations with you is not just to enjoy your conversation, but also to hopefully inspire others interested in these processes to see the way you have experienced it for decades as a psychiatrist. And now you're a teacher also, you have come to appreciate the value of integration. And for a long time you've been advocating it in a formal way in the formal institutions of the field. And yet people are reluctant. They're not participating as enthusiastically as our conversation today may appear.
Yeah, that's true.
It's not as exciting to them. And so the reason why I wanted you to come by, and
I would say it's anxiety provoking.
exactly, yes,
Yeah,
yeah. So there's no need for that anxiety, because if you're
Yeah.
close to the integrative process,
yeah.
anxiety dissipates.
I'm with you. Yep.
And so, as much as fun it is to talk about it, I hope it's also motivational, inspirational, thought provoking, and people can start implementing aspects of these ideas that we just covered
Yeah, yeah,
into their work, into their understanding of their work, and how the effects of their work um, challenges or alleviates a current or post understanding after
yeah, yeah,
the conversations like
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah. Very good. Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you. I appreciate your inviting me to enter into this with you.
Well, same here. I look forward to your book, and I think we should definitely schedule something for after the book to discuss your book.
That sounds good. Can I show the audience the cover?
Please do, yes.
Okay, here it is, August 20th. It's available on pre-order right now, and you can find out more about it from my Substack, which is Substack. No, it's How Therapy Works, all one word. .substack.com.
Excellent. I'll have some links in the show notes, and thank you very much, Dr. Smith. I'm looking
Very
forward
good.
to our next conversation.
Okay, Arshak, thank you very much.
Enjoy your summer. Have a great one. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.